Order!
Let us pray. O God, our Father, in difficult times, keep us from discouragement. In failure, keep us from despair. In success, keep us from thinking that we do not need your help. Help us remember there is no situation which you cannot help us, and no time in which you do not need your help. Grant us such wisdom of mind, such strength of will, such devotion of heart, that may seek to do the things that please you. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
This House is in session. Minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday, November 7th, 2023 to be confirmed. Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that the aforesaid minutes be confirmed.
The question is that the aforementioned minutes be confirmed. All those who are members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. The aforementioned minutes are hereby confirmed. Minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday, November 14th, 2023 to be deferred.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the aforesaid minutes be deferred.
The question is that the aforementioned minutes be deferred. All those who are members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. The aforementioned minutes are deferred.
Announcements by Your Honor, the Speaker. Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Petitions, papers.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I'm commanded to lay the audited financial statements of the Ellerslie School for the year ended March 31st, 2020.
Government notices.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of a resolution to approve the Barbados Physical Development Plan as amended 2023.
Private members notices. Notices of questions. Reports from select committees. First readings of bills.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the first reading of the National Insurance and Social Security Amendment Number 2 Bill 2023.
Questions that the aforementioned bill be read here first time. All those who are members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Statements by ministers, congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notices of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42 subsection 5, 43 and 44, and 56 for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Questions that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honourable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are hereby suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Government business, sir.
Government business is the order of the day.
Order number 9, sir. In the name of the Honourable Minister of Labour, Social Security and the Third Sector, to move the second reading of the National Insurance and Social Security Amendment number 2, Bill 2023.
Honourable Member for St. Peter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the year 2018, this government introduced to Barbados RIRI. And I'm not referring to Robin Rihanna Fenty, but we spoke even as we face difficult times, as we face substantial debt, as we face very low foreign exchange reserves, as we stared disaster in the face. We said to our people, we said to our country, that we had to adopt a mission that would involve retooling, empowering, retraining, and enfranchising. And we gave that approach to rescue and governance, we called it the RIRI approach. Retool, empower, retrain, enfranchise. Mr. Speaker, the empowering and enfranchising aspect of this approach to rescuing our economy and to moving us forward sustainably, that approach to governance, that approach to management, that approach to rescue meant that we set about encouraging entrepreneurship in this country. We realized that government alone could not provide all the means of earning. So government could not provide all the jobs that our people needed. But people need to earn, but government could not provide all those jobs. And so we were conscious, deliberate, and intentional about our approach to saying to our citizens, to saying to Barbadians all across this country, entrepreneurship is an important avenue for earning. Our entrepreneurship is an important avenue for being able to craft one's future in a sustainable manner. Now, we encourage that, and while we were encouraging that, we also recognize that many of our young people are part of what we refer to as the gig economy. And we made a decision that that approach to work, as a matter of fact, that approach to life, that approach to being able to discover and use one's talents, that approach to earning, living, developing, becoming, was one that we needed to encourage. And so gig economy participants, self-employed persons, entrepreneurship generally was the focus and remains the focus of this government. Along with encouraging entrepreneurship, along with encouraging business activity, along with encouraging people not to rely on others to offer them a job, but to create organizations, micro, small, medium, to create these organizations and then to launch out, to provide services, to create goods so that the wider public can buy in, literally buy in to these businesses, meant that we also had to focus on the ease of doing business. Often, this idea, this concept of the ease of doing business is assigned to agencies like the Barbados Revenue Authority, CAIPO, where businesses are registered. We believe that the Division of Commerce that offers licenses for various business activities, even the ministry responsible for labor and the Labor Department that also is responsible for certain licenses in certain areas of economic activity. We often believe that ease of doing business relates to that area. But Mr. Speaker, ease of doing business, the encouragement of entrepreneurship, the encouragement of business activity by individuals, by small groups, that encouragement and the ability for these people to do business is the responsibility of all of us. All ministries, all agencies of government, all departments of this country that we love have a responsibility to contribute toward improving the ease of doing business. As I speak of entrepreneurs, we may recall that not too long ago, in 2020, very early in 2020, we faced a very uncertain future, a reality which we know as the COVID-19 pandemic faced us. And in a pandemic, there is restriction of movement, restriction of all kinds of activity. And as a tourism-dependent economy, one could imagine, and one does not anymore have to imagine because we lived it, the fact that no commercial airlines came to bring passengers. We had some flights, but there were repatriation flights. The restriction of movement to engage in various levels and areas of economic activity. A cadre of workers in this country, a large group of entrepreneurs immediately felt the impact of not having customers to serve, not having customers to whom they could provide the goods that they had created. And Mr. Speaker, as a caring government, understanding that people, whether it is a pandemic or a hurricane, people have to eat. This government decided that it had to do something for our small business people. We had to do something for our entrepreneurial class. You know, Mr. Speaker, we did that recognizing that not many of that group of persons, not many of that group of very industrious persons were covered by our social security system. They were not participants, that is to say, they were not contributors to the National Insurance Scheme. But even though they were not contributing to the National Insurance Scheme, they still needed a level of protection. And as a caring government would, in spite of the fact that many of those persons were not covered by our social security system, we made a decision to implement what we have called a business interruption plan. Business interruption is a concept known to larger businesses. Larger businesses purchase business interruption insurance. I've had cause in my previous life to have to purchase that, especially when you operate both in the tourism industry, but also in the hurricane belt. One cannot take chances. But government, in spite of lack of participation by many of our micro businesses, many of our entrepreneurs who are operating in the small, micro and small sector, government made a decision that it would create this business interruption benefit that would allow entrepreneurs, small business people, to have some measure of income that would keep, if not their entire head above water, at least their noses above water. Our position, Mr. Speaker, was that we did not intend to allow any of our people to drown. We had to support. And so I believe that coming out of that experience, many of our small business people, many of our entrepreneurs recognize the need for protection, the need to have coverage just in case. And Mr. Speaker, we do not, as a government, beat up on those who do not necessarily participate. We are encouragers. But the reason we don't beat up on those who do not participate is because it is unfortunately too common across our landscape for persons to underestimate the need for insurance. And so from time to time, there are persons who may lose house possessions to fire. There are persons who, unfortunately, suffer debilitating illnesses where they have to spend large sums in medical expenses, and who only at that point in time recognize the importance of having insurance coverage. During 2020 and 2021, it is our view that many self-employed persons, many small entrepreneurs recognize the need for protection, particularly social protection given under a social security umbrella. There were persons, and this became very real to me, again, because of my previous life. taxi drivers. Some of my constituency, put down vehicles, even having to swing the engine every couple of days was a challenge, because swinging the engine meant petrol, as small amount as it may seem. But when there's no money coming in, that becomes a problem. Hair braiders, no money. There are persons who make craft items. There are jewelry makers, many types of crafts persons who were not able to earn, but who in that period of time recognized the need for coverage, the need to be covered by Social Security. Now, this government, as it worked through that period, engaged with entrepreneurs, engaged with small business people, and recognized with them that one of the impediments, I will not say it is necessarily the major impediment, but one of the significant impediments to engagement in the Social Security system, to participating in our national insurance scheme, was the difficulty posed by the structure that attended those who would participate but were self-employed. The system, as it stands, recognizes contributions every quarter, so that in the industry that I've come from, there are quarters when some of those who are engaged in the industry earn very little. As a matter of fact, net earnings for many people in some of those months, in some cases, April, May, June, sometimes September, July, August, September, sometimes September, so October, November, December, because the season really doesn't start in earnest until about the 20th or the 22nd of December. So that there are periods of time when there is no money to pay in, to use the way we put it. But the system is not structured to recognize that. It is structured to recognize consistency, because the system is built to recognize that, or to understand, or to facilitate those who work for somebody else. And it is built and designed assuming that there's a consistency of earnings, so that if there's a quarter when there are no earnings reported, there is the assumption that contributions are owing to the system. And if contributions are owing, then there are certain penalties, as there must be. If there's anything that is owing, there must be penalties. But the issue is the construction of the system. And as a government, we recognize that that was an area that we had to address if we were going to be able to encourage more self-employed persons to become a part of the national insurance scheme or Social Security mechanism. And so, Mr. Speaker, you would recall that in July of this year, when we laid the National Insurance Board's principal recommendations for the revitalization of the national insurance scheme, we laid this in this honorable chamber at the end of July of this year. And in the ministerial statement that I made at that time, I indicated to this honorable chamber that one of the significant outputs of these recommendations was a new regime for self-employed persons in the National Insurance Scheme rubric. We were accepting the recommendations of the core group that worked with the working group and the advisory group and all the stakeholders, took their recommendations on board and gave to us some ideas that we could use in fleshing out what that new regime could look like, with the ultimate aim, with the understanding that the intention was to facilitate the easier participation of entrepreneurs, of self-employed persons in our national insurance scheme. Now, I want to reinforce the point that this is being done, has as its goal the protection of our entrepreneurial class. It has as its goal the protection of those who, in some cases, refuse to beg somebody for a job, as they say, and decide that they will use their skill, they will use their initiative, they will use whatever gifts they have to earn their way in this world. That was our goal, because the non-participation of self-employed persons in the national insurance scheme may not initially, or on the face of it, be a challenge to the national insurance scheme, because outside of the business interruption benefit, if you don't participate, then you don't receive benefit. However, we recognize that our role in leading this country and managing this country's affairs goes beyond just looking after the scheme as a scheme and recognizing that the scheme is part of the construct of building this country. And so when people are not involved in the national insurance scheme, a scheme that was set up to provide social security, security for the population, then we have an issue that needs to be addressed. And so, Mr. Speaker, the recommendation of the core group, the recommendation of the board, was intended to develop a system, develop a scheme that would allow for increased involvement, increased participation by self-employed persons in what we consider to be a very, very important aspect of their lives, a very important aspect of what we in labor call decent work. Work is not decent if there's not protection for workers. Work will not be considered as decent work if there's not enough social security provisions for these persons. Now, before I go any further, I want to say something. I've spoken a lot about the fact that as a government, we've encouraged entrepreneurship. As a government, we have encouraged people to launch out on their own, to feel empowered. I indicated that the whole matter of ease of doing business has to do with encouraging people and facilitating them in this desire to be their own bosses and to do their own thing. But I have to point out, particularly to larger businesses and to other employers in this country, that our encouragement of entrepreneurship is not to be seen as or confused with misclassifying employees and making some arbitrary determination that they are not employees, but that they are self-employed. And I have to continue to say that because there are those who see the drive to encourage entrepreneurship, the drive to allow people to be involved as self-employed persons, as some kind of license to get away from their, what I call a moral obligation. So that we talk about decent work, but decent employers, decent business people also recognize a certain morality in business. And that morality includes making sure that persons who are really employees are so classified and that the social protection is afforded to them. There are some, and I'm hoping that the number is reducing, but that is a matter that the National Insurance, what would be the National Insurance and Social Security Service, has to put much more effort into than it currently is, but ensuring that people who are employees and are treated as such. Now, I will be the very first to say, but I've said it before, even as a government, we have not always gotten that right. But I continue to be happy to be part of an administration that when it gets something wrong and it becomes aware, it makes the necessary adjustments. And I'm calling on employers to follow the lead of government, so that if you've gotten it wrong in terms of classifying your workers, this is a good time, as good a time as any, to make that change and properly classify. But I always have to be very clear that the encouraging of self-employment and the facilitating of self-employment is not to cause genuine employees to be wrongly classified, misclassified as self-employed persons. Now, the primary recommendations, as I stated in the ministerial statement, the primary recommendations for changes to the self-employed coverage and administering that new regime are full flexibility related to when people can pay, how much they can pay in a given year, the mode of paying without forms, without monthly minimums, without monthly maximums, without due dates. Paying, as we would say in Barbados, paying as the money comes. That is the intention with the flexibility in this new regime. You pay as you earn your money. If in October and September you earned nothing, you're not expected to pay. If in April and May and June you earn nothing, you're not expected to pay. If you had a bumper crop over, you can pay extra in to bring up your annual amount. Full flexibility. The ability to pay contributions online. And this is using the technology, using the taxi driver in their car. I'm going to talk about what you know. Park in First Street or Second Street, at the top of the street, waiting for somebody to come by, or park by Massey in Old Town, waiting for a job. You can actually make your payment in your car or in your van while you are waiting for the next job, using the technology, recognizing that the hair braider on the beach in Old Town or at Haywoods, hopefully that will happen in the not too distant future. We need Haywoods developed, and the Honourable Member for Christchurch West knows that, and he is trying his best to, he will speak to some of that in the physical development plan. But the hair braider on the beach, who, for fear of losing a job, does not want to leave to go anywhere, can make the contribution online. The National Insurance Scheme will then convert those contributions into earnings that will determine eligibility for benefits that will be shared, conveyed, communicated to those who contribute. Self-employed persons will also have coverage extended to include employment injury. And I'm going to speak to that a little bit more, in a little bit more detail shortly. But in extending coverage to employment injury is important, and also allowing for persons who are employees, but who in their employment are not contributing at the maximum, and who are industrious enough to have a side hustle. Those persons will be able to register as self-employed with respect to this side hustle and also contribute so that they can bring their contributions up closer or even to the maximum that is allowed. And of course, as is currently the case, those who contribute, those who are part of the system, are able to go online and see what their status is, what their contribution history is. And those who are self-employed, who don't have the time to go and spend half day, maybe bus, walking, driving, as the case may be, and losing out on their business, will be able to understand what their status is. Now, the National Insurance Board and the National Insurance Department has taken this matter of the self-employed regime very seriously. And from the end of May, the board set up a project to address this matter and to work through the details. And here we are today, Mr. Speaker, with the results of the work that was done to make this new regime a reality. I am going to interject at this point to say that the bill before us today is the National Insurance Amendment Bill, Amendment number 2 bill. And I need to explain the structure of this bill. In our communication with the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, it was felt that based on what we were doing, and a couple of things I will speak to a little bit later, that it made sense, it made better sense, that it was cleaner to have a bill that incorporates the components of governance that we debated in this honorable chamber at the end of July and in the other place at the beginning of August, and that we include those additional things that were to be included, that were to be added to the governance side, and that we include as well those provisions that relate to the self-employed persons of this country, the new self-employed regime. So that this bill, Mr. Speaker, is structured to include what we have already discussed and agreed in both houses of this Parliament. The bill also includes, in terms of the additions that were to be made to the bill from July-August, the role of the Chief Legal Officer, a fuller explanation of the employment of public officers. That needed to be a little bit clearer. And Mr. Speaker, we were and remain very cognizant of our workers at the National Insurance Department. Some level of discomfort in some of the provisions, Some need for greater clarity. Some need to be clear in their minds that what we were saying about the provisions, that they would not be at any disadvantage, that it could be more clearly codified in the legislation. And as responsible employers, Mr. Speaker, we believe that it was prudent to do just that. And so there is that, and I think we would remember that there was an amendment we had to make where we'd included board as opposed to state. That was ventilated in the other place, and that amendment has been made. But the substance of this bill is that new self-employed regime. That regime that allows for persons to be able to participate because it is important that they do so. Now, this bill also includes the date for it coming into effect. You will recall, Mr. Speaker, that in our debate in July, the bill included that it would come into force at a date to be set by proclamation. We have been working assiduously from even before we debated the bill. We'd been working with a beginning of December time in our frame. And I'm happy to share that at this point, the management and team of the National Insurance Department are happy to be able to share that they are ready for transition on December 1st of this year. And so this bill includes the fact that it will come into effect on December the 1st. Now, with respect to the provisions for self-employed persons, I want to share maybe a few more details about what that looks like. There will be a minimum annual payment of contributions, a minimum annual, not a minimum weekly, not a minimum monthly, not a minimum quarterly, but a minimum annual. Minimum annual of $1,200, $1,200 per contribution year. That will be the minimum. Now, the question will be, what does that mean? If we use the self-employed person contribution rate of 17.1%, that $1,200 in contributions as a minimum, as a floor, not the maximum, this is just a floor. That works out to earnings of roughly $585 per month. Roughly $585 per month, or $135 per week. Mr. Speaker, we've set it with two things in mind. The amount needs to make sense as it relates to the kind of coverage that a person can have. So it cannot be $100 a year. It cannot be $200 a year. It has to make sense because our intention is to treat people with the value that they deserve. And so if we're going to provide benefit, if we're going to provide coverage, then we intend to provide proper coverage, decent benefit. And so we believe that $1,200 per year in contributions represented an appropriate floor, taking into consideration that we have a wide range of business activity in this self-employed person space. People may be earning $5,000 a month, self-employed, but there may be some earning $1,000 a month, self-employed. So it was set to make sure that the benefit made sense. It was also set to make sure that it was affordable to all self-employed persons. And that is why we believe that $135 a week, if you're self-employed, that should be, well, I, Mr. Speaker, myself and the team at National Insurance really hope that there will not be self-employed persons who fall below this in terms of earning. And if there are, then as a society, we maybe have a responsibility to do more to make sure that those business persons can improve their revenue. And so that is one of the provisions in the bill. The bill at the back has many of the consequential amendments, and we will see many of what I'm going to share will be reflected in the consequential amendments that come out of this change to the regime for self-employed persons. I spoke already to the contributions and how they can be paid, full flexibility. And Mr. Speaker, it is really very important, and I'm repeating this, for self-employed persons to understand that they can pay once in the year if you come across a $4,000 or $5,000 and you decide, look, I got the money now, because most people like me, know that sometimes you may feel you have a little money in your hand and something happens and all of a sudden the money gone. And you ask yourself, but I don't even know where the money gone. So that sometimes when you have the little cash in your hand, you want to pay. And if a person has $2,000, $3,000 and they want to pay that, that can cover the entire year. If they want to pay piece by piece, if they want to pay in the busy time for your industry, that is when you pay. We have also, and I share this in the ministerial statement in July, we've also included in this bill provision for self-employed persons to contribute toward prior years, so that a self-employed person can contribute for 3 years in the past. Because remember, Mr. Speaker, benefits, but particularly pension, contributory pension, needs a certain amount of contributions. And so we believe that it would be fair, that it is fair to self-employed persons who may have spent some years outside of the system, not contributing. Some may not have contributed out of their own decision-making, some because it was too difficult to participate, whatever the reason. As a reasonable government, we believe that it is right, that it is appropriate to offer self-employed persons the opportunity to do some catching up. We believe it is important. We believe it is right. We believe it is human. And that is the government that is responsible for the management of the affairs of this country today. That is the government that the country has voted for so overwhelmingly in 2 elections so far. So that over a 3-year period, well, going back 3 years, self-employed persons can make contributions. What I also said in the ministerial statement in July was that while we are reaching out to self-employed persons, while we are providing that avenue to do some catching up, there's going to be a penalty. That there has to be, because there is a certain level of lost earnings. If you haven't contributed, or if you're contributing after the fact, the time value of money, the Honourable Member for Christchurch, East Central, is expert at this, but the time value of money will say that the contribution today does not have the same value as the contributions 3 years ago. And we have been very clear that we will be accepting the contributions and applying them for 3 previous years, but that it will come with a penalty. Mr. Speaker, I actually, even though I use the word penalty, I feel very happy to be able to say that that penalty is only 5%. 5%. That is the, let me use the word humanity of the administration. It is the humanity of the people who lead at National Insurance as we speak. Because, Mr. Speaker, this design comes in large measure from the work of the management and the team of the National Insurance Department. And maybe it is easy to understand why the team at National Insurance, I said this in July, said and insisted, they actually gave the minister instruction, insisted that the organization would be called not any authority or anything like that. They wanted to be called the National Insurance and Social Security Service. This team recognizes its mandate to serve. And even though they are, like us, not perfect, so there will be some times when a person may not get the service that they deserve or that ought to be afforded them. They recognize, the team at National Insurance, recognize that they're on a journey. And this journey continues, the journey to improve. And so the penalty, the surcharge, which is a nicer word, and that is the word I think that we use, but I prefer to use a word that people can understand. Sometimes surcharge may not be fully understood. I want it to be clear that it is a penalty. However, that penalty, that surcharge, is only 5%. Now, the team at National Insurance also did some work on how we would address this matter of employment injury. There's a saying in Barbados that you give an inch and they take an L.
Or a yard.
Or a yard. That was when you were at school. There's no meter. There was a concern that we did not want to let our good be evil spoken of. To do something good for the people of this country, particularly for the self-employed persons in this country, but that we would have a situation where the few, the minority, would so seek to misuse and exploit it that it would become a challenge to the overall National Insurance and Social Security scheme. And so there are some provisions for a claim, if a claim is made for employment injury by a self-employed person. Now, just understand that when you work for somebody, so a person slips and falls in a restaurant, there are ordinarily other staff members or guests around. If you squeeze your hand in the back office, in a supermarket, in the back store, you packing stuff, there usually one or two other people who are there. Many self-employed persons work on their own. And so there is an inherent difficulty in corroborating information. And so a claim for employment injury benefit must include a personal report of the cause of the injury. Now that is basic. If you're presenting with a claim or making a claim, you are making a personal report. A report from a registered medical practitioner. Now that is going to be important because we have to have corroboration. So if you're hurt sufficient that you need to claim, then you should have gone to a medical practitioner. And so a report from a registered medical practitioner will be needed. If the incident was witnessed by anybody, then an eyewitness report, a report from that eyewitness will also be required if there was an eyewitness. A copy of the contract for service related to the task, job, service, or undertaking in which the injury occurred. A self-employed person has entered into a relationship with somebody who was bought in their service or is buying product, goods. There ought to be some record of that relationship. And so a copy of that contract for service or for services will need to be provided as well. And Mr. Speaker, I think that this will work for many situations. There will be some situations where it will not be applicable, but the scheme, the regime that governs self-employed persons will, if there is that kind of a relationship, that is to say, and I'm just let me, for clarity, say for example, a hair braider who is running his or her own business will not necessarily have a contract for service with the person whose hair is being braided on the beach. The National Insurance and Social Security Service will take these nuances into account. A copy of a police report, again, if that is applicable, and if there are photographs, videos of the incident and of the injury, and then any other information that the board would require or believe would be important in substantiating the claim. And so these have been put in place so that it does not become impossible to claim, but that there are certain safeguards to make sure that we don't have abuse. It's probably the best way I should put it. We want to make sure that we do not have abuse. Now, Mr. Speaker, I already said that this act will come into force on December the 1st. I also said earlier that the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel was of the view we agreed that it was cleaner, tidier to have a single amendment to the existing national insurance legislation. And so what we debated and agreed and approved in July and August is also part of this. And because of that, this bill will also repeal and replace that original bill so that we have a single amendment that will amend the national insurance legislation, allow for the governance, the new governance structure that we've already agreed, and allow for the self-employed regime, the new self-employed person regime that we are debating substantially today. As it relates, Mr. Speaker, to the transition, I owe it to this honorable chamber and I owe it to the country to indicate that a transition from a department of government / a board structure. So this kind of a hybrid situation. A transition from that arrangement to a full-fledged statutory body, a commercial state-owned enterprise, is not possible unless the people who work in the organization are prepared to transition with the organization. It will not work otherwise. Organizations don't run themselves. There are some who seem to feel so. People run organizations. And so if people are not prepared to go with the transition, then the transition can't happen. Simply can't happen. I am pleased, Mr. Speaker, to be able to report that there are assigned by the Ministry of the Public Service to the National Insurance Department and working at the National Insurance Department today, working within the National Insurance Department, assigned by the Ministry of the Public Service, 267 persons. 267 persons. I am absolutely overjoyed to be able to say to you, Mr. Speaker, and to be able to say to the country that 92.5% of those persons have agreed to transition to the National Insurance and Social Security Service. (247) of the 267. In keeping with our approach to governance, where people are at the center, where people matter, those persons who have opted not to transition, those who are working in national insurance today, but who have opted not to transition, they have already met with the Ministry of the Public Service, and details are being worked out as to how they will be absorbed in the wider public service system. This, Mr. Speaker, is not an exercise to cause anybody to have any challenges. It was not intended to force people into doing anything. It was not intended to penalize persons who did not agree with the direction in which we were going. All the options were kept open. But I have to say that we on a continuing basis kept before the workers what the facts were, how we were progressing. There were times when some members of staff said they felt as though they weren't hearing anything. Mr. Speaker, once we became aware of that sentiment, we immediately set about sharing more information, engaging with staff members. There is a certain view going around, and I'm trying not to sound boastful, even though I feel really good. But there's a certain view going around that the way that this transition was done really should be the benchmark that is used. But that's a view going around. I didn't say it was my view. It is something that I've heard, and it's not everything that you should repeat. Everything that you hear you should repeat. But it sounded so good, Mr. Speaker, that I thought that I would repeat it.
Honourable member, you know the thing about self-praise. Just continue.
No, not self-praise at all. I heard somebody say that.
Yes.
And I thought that I would. As a matter of fact, it is because it is not self-praise, because I heard somebody say it, that I thought I would. If I hadn't heard anybody say it, Mr. Speaker, I would not have said it myself.
That is well said. Yeah. Continue.
Thank you very much. There are some persons and groups of persons who I really have to thank. So this is not self-praise. This is me doing some praising. Yeah. I first must express a whole lot of gratitude to the permanent secretary in my ministry, who has been with me now 20, 21, 22, 4 years. PS is not usually in ministries for that long, but I don't mind begging, and I've begged the Prime Minister, the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast, not to move my PS whenever there were rumors of movement. Once I hear rumors, I try to get ahead of the rumor. I have to thank, a lot of thanks to my permanent secretary, who has taken this project under her wing, who has led it, who has, she may not want me to say this, but you know, sometimes you ask questions about something, and the answer I would hear is, Minister, I am wearing blinkers. Whenever I hear Minister, I'm wearing blinkers, it meant I really, on behalf for St. George North, it meant I really can't take you on with that now. I'm focusing on this major issue. And I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, because what we were dealing with was not a minor matter. It was a matter of great importance. It involved lots of people. Over 250 persons were involved. Persons who, during the process, at some points, felt uneasy, felt unsure about the future, felt uncertain about how it would all turn out. And this process needed focused and dedicated attention. And the permanent secretary in my ministry give this process focused and dedicated attention. She made a statement. She made a statement that I've already commended to the cabinet, and I am taking it for my own life as well. She said, I will put my foot on every rung of the ladder, not skipping any, every rung. Methodical is the word. Methodical, so that we end up at this point where management and staff of the National Insurance Department are ready for that December 1st transition. I also need to thank the chairman, who very actively led the board and worked very closely with the permanent secretary on this. He did what the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast often tells us to do. Roll up your sleeves. Come to work every day to do this, roll up your sleeves, and the chairman did exactly that. And I thank the chairman for his role in leading the board in this process. The management team worked hard in this process as well, not just with respect to the developing the self-employed persons, coming with the name, working on the organizational structure, giving input from when stuff was heard on the ground that needed to be responded to. The management team of the National Insurance Department also needs to be given sincere congratulations and thanks for their work. The staff of the National Insurance Department. Mr. Speaker, staff in any service organization, those persons on the front lines are often the ones that get beaten up the most. They're the ones who receive the irate calls. Those are the ones who get abused. Those are the ones who are expected to hold their tongues. Those are the ones who every now and then forget to hold the tongue and probably get more criticism for it. But they are on the front line. On the front line. They're the ones who, when a determination is made about whether or not the organization is providing good service, it is often based on the experience that customers and clients have with those at the front line. I want to thank all staff members. I've had a couple of meetings with them, a number of meetings with them, from the time when we shared the actuarial review, even before we made it public. We've engaged with staff. Staff have been, the staff at National Insurance Department are no different to any of us or to any other Barbadians. When change is ahead of us, we have sometimes trepidation. And so the staff at the National Insurance Department did not act out of character when compared to any other human being. And I thank them for speaking to the issues, asking or demanding responses. I thank them for understanding the responses and making their decisions. Those who made a decision to transition and those who decided not to. We are very, very happy with the work and the role of our staff in this entire process. I also have to thank the National Union of Public Workers and the General Secretary. They engaged with us with respect to much of the terms and the conditions and the legislation, the organizational chart. They engage and they work with us to make sure that their members, our workers, our staff, got the best deal that was possible. Their interests were protected, and so I thank the NUPW and particularly its General Secretary for their work. With respect to the revitalization, Mr. Speaker, there is somebody who ate, slept, drank this whole revitalization and leading the engagement with the public, leading the work of the core group, who I had occasion to say, well, you obviously not doing anything else all day. And that person is the deputy chair of the National Insurance Board. He dedicated significant time, effort. As a matter of fact, unfortunately, I think there was one time when his daughter, if I remember correctly, was celebrating, no, not celebrating, was going to leave the country, and he needed to spend some time with her. And it's not nice to, there was no intention to break up a family. The family is not broken up. It's just that we had to take some of the time that should have been spent as good family time. But the Deputy Chair of the National Insurance Board contributed significantly to the work of the revitalization exercise, the self-employed persons regime, the big picture where that was concerned. And he worked with the core team, the working group, and the advisory group, along with engaging all of the stakeholders. We met with former board members, former chairs, we met with faith-based organizations, the Social Partnership, we met with the Democratic Labour Party, we met with the Alliance Party for Progress, we met with the BWU, we met with independent senators, we met with the NUPW, we met with BARC, we met with Unity Workers Union, we met with media managers. Before we got to the public town halls, we met with, it felt like everybody. And the deputy chair led in all of this. I also have to thank a colleague, the Honourable Member for St. Michael South Central, who was one of the members of the core group, the core team that worked on all of this. And I thank all the stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, we got hundreds and hundreds of suggestions from the people of this country. And many of these suggestions centered around bringing self-employed persons into the fold of the National Insurance Scheme, bringing self-employed persons under the umbrella of social protection, recognizing that self-employed persons need to be covered need to be protected, also recognizing that in a social security system, we need a wide and large base of persons so that we can provide the protection that is necessary to all participants, but particularly to the most vulnerable in our society. Mr. Speaker, as I wrap up, I just want to say to us all, government is well on its way to revitalize and re-energize our social security system. We said from the very beginning, last year, around the middle of last year, we are not a government that plays politics with people's lives and well-being. We are not a government that sees danger ahead and decides, well, the timeline might be after our time, so leave it for somebody else. We, like the wise man, we see danger ahead, we address it. We are a government, Mr. Speaker, who believes, or a government that believes, that we have a responsibility to all of our citizens. And whether or not a person decides that they're not going to participate because of what, in Barbados, we call it worthlessness, we believe we have a responsibility still as those persons entrusted with leadership. And so, along with all the legislation that we've brought, the management of the National Insurance and what will be the National Insurance and Social Security Service, once the bill becomes an act, they already know and recognize that there is much work still to be done with reference to educating Barbadians. Legislation is not all, but legislation is important. There is work to do with respect to educating Barbadians about the importance of social security, educating Barbadians to the fact that there can be no decent work if the worker is not appropriately protected by social security. And so we will, as an organization, press on with that education, with that sensitizing, with that encouraging. We will be putting more feet on the ground to make sure that we visit those places where persons are employed and make sure that all employees are covered in the national insurance scheme. We are saying to Barbadians today, particularly self-employed persons, national insurance is not an option. COVID has shown us that stuff can happen. We are vulnerable still to pandemics. Mr. Speaker, at COP28 this year, in a climate discussion, there's going to be a day dedicated to health, a recognition that there's an intersection between climate and health. As a matter of fact, they can collide. Rising temperatures do all kinds of things to the human body. We are talking in different fora about the impact of heat on work. So there are challenges that we are facing, and those pathogens that can become more virulent with warmer temperatures lie in our future. And so I say to self-employed persons, there can be future pandemics. Hurricanes, more powerful than the one that passed us a couple years ago, can hit us in the future. None of us want that future, but that future is possible. I appeal to self-employed persons. to take advantage of the easing of the ability to participate in this our social security system. Take advantage of the fact that it will now be easier to participate. Remember the business interruption that had to be provided to you when you were not participant but were impacted by the pandemic. Remember what this could mean to you and to your family. And so, Mr. Speaker, self-employed persons we must all come to the realization that, as the National Insurance slogan says, it is really much more than a contribution. Much, much more than a contribution. In the world in which we live, national insurance, social security is a veritable lifeline. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I am obliged to you, and I ask that this bill be read a second time.
Honourable Member for St. George North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by thanking the Minister of Labour, the Honourable Member for St. Peter, for his very clear explanation of the amendments before us in the National Insurance and Social Security Amendment Number 2 Bill 2023. The Honourable Minister articulated very effectively what I consider, sir, to be the major and substantive change in the amendment before us, which makes provision for the expanded coverage under the national insurance system for self-employed people. Changes that, amongst other things, would seek to ensure social welfare rights for the self-employed, including the provision of access to employment injury benefits. And that is major, because up until this change, self-employed people can contribute for the purpose of pension, but this very provision, so that in times where your business, you can't conduct your ordinary course of business due to some injury or so on, this is now a provision that allows them to benefit from this. And Minister articulated very eloquently on it, but I wonder how many people see the significance of the change that is before us. But sir, where I want to spend some time is in the classification of the self-employed. While the Honourable Member for St. Peter was very careful to distinguish between what these amendments make provision for as it relates to self-employed people, sir, I think that it is necessary to elaborate on it a bit more. Because from where I sit very often, you find workers that would come and ask questions around the fact why it is that I went up to the NIS and they wouldn't allow me to register as a self-employed person. I have a contract that says I'm self-employed. The indications are that I should go and I should make my own contributions. I am willing to make these contributions. I'm ready to make them. But when I get up to the NIS, the people up there wouldn't let me register. It is important to point out, sir, that the NIS has authority to make a determination for NIS purposes on a person's status based on the provisions of the relevant act, the national insurance legislation. And why it's important to point that out, Because it says, therefore, that it matters not what some person tells you that you are. The NIS is not obligated to go on the basis of that. What matters is that any officer of the NIS undertaking his or her function on behalf of the NIS has a responsibility to ensure that for NIS purposes, and that is determining on contributions and determining on benefits, that certain determinations relative to a person's contributions and benefits are satisfied. And I want to spend some time on it. Because, Mr. Speaker, what we have been observing over time is a very worrying trend where we find a number of workers in pseudo-employment or maybe quasi-employment. And what do I mean by that? Where they're being told, Mr. Speaker, that you're under a contract. But when you do the control test, as per our Employment Rights Act, and the control test as per good human resources practices, what we find, sir, is that people who are often being told that there are contractors are actually employees. And I say this is a worrying trend because sometimes employers get confused. And I don't speak to those employers who get confused out of ignorance because they genuinely believe that there's a contract, that another kind of contract that they're dealing with. But sir, what is concerning is a worrying trend where we have evidence of very bad employers in a number of different respects. And when it comes to assigning whether or not workers are under a contract of service or contract for service, some of us will want to make excuses for them because all of a sudden they become good. Could they know? But breaking it down, the misclassification of a worker as being under a contract for service, when indeed that worker is under a contract of service, is something that has to be concerning to the NIS, but should not only be concerning to the NIS, but should be concerning to all of us, because the issue of, or the concern of equality of treatment, therefore, arises as it relates to access to benefits and so on. I'm not talking, therefore, of workers who might be on project work. We're not referring to consultants who will be engaged for a time. But when you look at the test of whether a worker is on a contract of or a contract for service, there are a number of important elements that we must be concerned with. And I spent some time highlighting a few of them. During the process of determination, parties are interviewed at the NIS. The NIS doesn't just decide that they're not going to allow you to contribute. They will interview a worker. They won't just look at a letter, they will talk to the worker. They will even engage the person with whom they are in a contract with. And there are certain questions that will come up. Does the person have managerial control over their activities? That's a no-brainer, in a sense. If you have no managerial control over the functions that you are supposed to execute, it begs the question straight off, can you be under a contract for service, or are you under a contract of service? Does the person have the right to hire and fire the staff that are working with them? If the answer is yes, maybe you are under a contract for service. But if the answer is no, as in the person with whom you've entered the contract is providing the labor that's supposed to help you execute your job, that's another test. Are they registered for VAT? Now, we know that there are people that will go under and so on, but that is a test. Whether you're VAT registered or not is another indication that can be looked at. Can the person refuse to carry out work without sanction? Because any of us can refuse to carry out work. If I'm my own boss, if I'm self-employed, I do so at my own risk. But if in doing so, I incur some sanction for some person who deducts a portion of my remuneration or whatever because I have refused to carry out or decides to end my service, then that's another test. But this is the one that, wearing another hat often, Mr. Speaker, I find most intriguing when you find people try to explain around it. Is the work organizationally embedded? What does that mean? Does it form part of the organization's core activity? Because if a function forms part of an organization's core activity, but that organization proceeds to engage a number of contractors in its core activity, that in its sense is a signal straight away that something fishy is going on. There's some avoidance that is intended that is not expressed in the letter offering you a contract for service. Because if something touches an organization at its core, it begs the question, why would you then be consistently engaging people in 6-month contract here, extending it by 3 months, extending it by 3 months, and doing so, Mr. Speaker, sometimes over 4, 5, 6 years? It is embedded. It is something, therefore, that you're clearly trying to avoid the obligations that one has as an employer if you have employees. But what you're doing is undermining that other parties' access to welfare benefits. Mr. Speaker, the changes before us, therefore, does not address this type of situation. What it addresses is genuine self-employed situations. Because if after December 1st, when these changes are put into effect, and an employee goes to the national insurance, say in April next year, claiming that they are self-employed, and that they want to register that way, or they go online, as there's now the provision to register as self-employed, they're still going to butt a stumbling block if, when the control and determination tests are done, they're not self-employed persons and they must be registered in another category. So the amendments before us too were very careful to make a distinction in making allowance for hybrid relationships that recognize, as the minister put it, that sometimes people will be involved in a hustle. So on the one hand, you might be working one place where you are in a contract of service, that is, you have an employer, so you register there. And on the other hand, in your spare time, to make the hustle, you are a self-employed person, so it allows you to register as both and be able to bump up your benefits for down the road if something is to happen. And that's very beautiful. But in doing that, in making that provision, the amendment recognized that there is a distinction. And that distinction has implication for the kind of benefit that you attract. And because it has that implication, therefore due care must be taken not only by the officers of the National Insurance, but by the Labor Department too. That falls under the purview of the Honourable Member for St. Peter. But that employers before it needs some kind of monitoring and so on, that employers would make sure that they themselves, in offering a contract, put it through the test to verify whether or not it is contract of or contract for. Mr. Speaker, the minister was very clear, the honorable member for St. Peter was very clear to point out that government itself, as the largest employer, has not been without blame from time to time for having workers engaged in contracts for service when really those workers should have been on the contracts of service. He was very clear in pointing that out. And Mr. Speaker, I would not wish to stand here in any capacity and suggest that there may not still be instances where government is guilty. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that wherever there are those instances and evidence of it being brought to bear, being brought to the fore, that those are situations that we make haste in seeking to address them. Mr. Speaker, as recently as a few months ago, about 3 months ago, 2-3 months ago, in one of our social welfare departments, for instance, we had to correct the situation. Up to yesterday, in a meeting that I participated in with the Honourable Minister for Tourism, we were seeking to correct another situation of contract. And in this particular situation, and there are a number like these, what we saw was a practice where workers were engaged for 11 months and 1 week and had their contract broken for 6 weeks. Having their contract broken then for 6 weeks. I hear the UN do that, but we in BIM, and this is poor people that we are often undermining. So a worker is given a contract and is allowed to work for 11 months and 1 week. So instead of giving you vacation, I break your contract for 6 weeks. And why I break your contract for 6 weeks is because in some part of the law, if you have broken service for 6 weeks, it is not deemed continuous, so all of the benefits and so on that ordinarily would be entitled to permanent status would not fall on you. Mr. Speaker, I don't think that in all cases is bad money. I think in many cases it is. But what these changes and what the treatment of contracts of service versus contracts for service tells us, what is important at the end of the day is the material work relationship. What you intended is of no importance. At the end of the day, what is tested is the material work relationship. So in government's case, I remember well with the ash workers. The intention never was to keep the ash workers on for 2 years. The intention was to bring them in for 3 weeks. But we had more ash boat here than you could clean in 3 weeks. And it went on, and then you realize, but look, while we focusing on ash, you got bush, you got drains, you got every sort of thing, so don't let them go along, keep them on. So what was intended as a good gesture to make sure that we were able to address our environmental surroundings and have them a lot more presentable, indeed a lot more presentable than we're seeing reoccurring, but that's a subject for another day. What was intended as a good gesture on the part of government to fix that problem while also addressing the important reality of people's pockets turned out into be an intention where government found itself guilty of the very thing that I'm speaking about now, where it was not paying in to the NIS system, and where government had to move to correct that. Similarly, for the community workers and so on, health workers, the home care workers and so on. So, but what I'm saying, yes, well, we recognize and we corrected. We had to correct on the basis of the fact that our intention did not matter at the end of the day. Intention, though pure, does not matter. What matters is the material work relationship, and we must satisfy the test. Answer those questions, a yes or no to those. Some of those questions I mentioned earlier will determine that. Mr. Speaker, I spoke about the history of some very bad employers. And while the major change before us this morning is that which makes allowance for self-employed, genuine self-employed people to be able to benefit from the system, we cannot speak about the breaches or the undermining of contractual relations, like the pseudo relationships and so on I spoke about, without recognizing that even as the NIS transitions, that this whole business of monitoring and managing bad employers is something that will continue, and something where efforts have to be made to ensure that this monitoring is beefed up, so that we don't find ourselves with liability to the National Insurance and Social Security Service, beyond which then it is reasonably expected that people can pay, and where we start having soft heart and saying, there is too much, so forgive them, forgive them, forgive them. Monitoring and evaluation has to be done, Mr. Speaker, all along the way to make sure that things don't build up in the way they do. Because some of these same employers that will find themselves guilty over time of undermining contractual arrangements, deliberately misclassifying workers so that they don't have to pull their pockets any further. In other aspects, we see that they're bad and that they need reeling in. And I speak specifically of the situation where workers turn up to work every day, every week, every month, will have NIS deducted from their wages or their salaries. So the worker goes off and as per the pay slip, feels my NIS money going in. Again, take out by going in. Mr. Speaker, very often these very workers only realize when they have to proceed on maternity leave, have to proceed on sick leave, that there is no benefit there. Does the NIS leave them out in the cold? Very often not. But a process that should be seamless for them has to become more cumbersome as the steps have to be taken then to battle with their employer to make sure that the benefits come in. I submit that in a revitalized national insurance system, we have to make sure that we have the resources available to us to do effective monitoring on a systematic basis to make sure that a worker who has been paying in for 3 years don't have to go and see that nothing has been submitted for them. The worker's responsibility is there, yes, and I challenge workers equally to use the online portal to make sure that your benefits are being submitted. But our system also has to balance that to ensure that we are doing all that is necessary to ensure our people are fully protected. So, Mr. Speaker, I said that it is not only for what will become the National Insurance and Social Security Service to do this effective monitoring and enforcement, because monitoring is one thing, because we monitor and we just know, but we don't enforce the provisions of the legislation. So I said it's not only for the NIS to do the monitoring and enforcement, but it is also for the Labor Department and, of course, very keen members of the labor movement to keep them on their toes to ensure that they do the monitoring and enforcement as well. I don't believe that every recommendation that has been made, thanks to the inputs of those members of the public who over the last 18 months have been very vocal on this issue and so on. I don't believe that every recommendation automatically now takes root simply because the NIS is going to be transitioning from central government to a board. But I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that the 92+% of the workers of the NIS that have said yes to the transitioning, I believe, Mr. Speaker, that they are equal to the task of ensuring a full transformation into an effective system of social security in this country. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that their indication of their willingness to transition is in itself a commitment that they themselves want to be part of the process towards improving and enhancing the efficiency and effectiveness of social security in Barbados. And we salute you. We salute all workers and, of course, the board that will ensure that the recommendations that have been given are effectively implemented. Mr. Speaker, transition does not happen because we say the word or because we state it as an objective. Transition comes about because of commitment. And I thank the government for for being steadfast and indicating publicly, through even coming back here with these amendments as quickly as we did in less than 4 months' time, for expressing its commitment publicly. I thank the Ministry of Labor, the new parent ministry, for ensuring that they've kept us true to the commitment, and the board, as I said, and all staff. But I also urge members of the public, even as I close, to recognize the tremendous responsibility that is all ours to ensure that this national insurance remains a lifeline. More than a contribution, the lifeline of all of us. So it is incumbent on all of us, where we know that there are breaches, where we know that there are instances where people are not doing what they're supposed to do, where we report it and where we keep the enforcement of our lifeline as tight as we possibly can. I commend everyone who has taken part in ensuring that we've come this far, and I look forward to working with all of you to ensure that we continue to deliver for workers in this country during their employment and after their employment, a system that can make us all proud. With these few words, Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Honourable Member for Christchurch East.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to weigh in on what is perhaps one of the most controversial pieces of legislation on our books in terms of what the policy position was, what the aim of the legislation was, what the actual results were, and what the enforcement is. If we think about any self-employed person is aware of the NIS legislation that governs the NIS. Most self-employed persons, about 85% of them, have opted out of the NIS and participating in the scheme. Most persons, for years, most lawyers, doctors, accountants, for years have taken the position that they will handle their own insurance and make provision for their own retirement. And a lot, sir, of persons have viewed the NIS as the pie in the sky. It is something that crystallizes, your benefits crystallize at some time in the future. When you're 20 years old and starting to work, you're not thinking about what is going to happen when you're 65 or 70 years old. If you can defer paying, you will defer paying. If you can avoid paying, you'll avoid paying, because you want to take home as much of what you earn with no thought for the consequences that are down the road. I'm speaking, sir, quite honestly and practically as someone who has been in the system for a while. So I've never worked for anybody else. The first time I had a boss, sir, was in 2018. And that was a bit of a culture shock for me. Sir, what really is the power of the NIS to ensure compliance? For employers, you have to pay on behalf of your staff, your employees. There's no leeway in there. You have to make those payments. So even the self-employed persons, sir, who employ other people, whereas you have to pay for your receptionist, and you have to pay for your secretary, and you have to pay for the cleaner in the office, they ought to not pay for themselves. Sir, we all know about that case where a lawyer was brought before the courts for not paying his NIS, for not making his contributions. And the position was that although the legislation appeared to make it mandatory, there were no penalties attached for non-compliance. The penalty was that at the end, when you're looking for your berry, there was none there. But as I said, that is something down the line and in the future. But there was no charge, there was no fine, there was no bond. So we ended up, sir, with a piece of legislation that purported to govern a class or to include a class, but there were no teeth for enforcement of it. You could go after that class if they failed to honor their duty to persons under them, but you could not go after that class, or there was nothing to gain by going after that class for not fulfilling the obligation to themselves. And this went on for a while. And people seemed to be happy with it. Persons who were self-employed when they retired, sir, they either had made adequate provision or they suffered at the end of their life. And people bailed them out, and their families would have bailed them out. But imagine the situation that happened with COVID. With COVID, Barbados ground to a halt. There was nothing happening. Employees were laid off. Persons who were self-employed could not go and do the work because you were under restrictions. Nobody didn't want you in the house anyhow. Business came to a standstill. The persons who were previously employed were able to turn to the lifeline to get some assistance. Those who were self-employed that deferred consideration of that eventuality until sometime way down in the future were forced to deal with it at that point in time. And the government stepped up to the plate. The government recognized that this was unprecedented, that, you know what, you can't seek to make an example of people at a point in time when it may cripple their ability to actually protect themselves or even their families. And in the grand scheme of things, to use a pun, the government looked to also help and include and cover those persons who had never made a contribution, because it was the right thing to do. The government was not obliged during COVID to bail out anybody, bail out a fella who decided that he did not want to be a part of the NS scheme or did not want to participate. Sir, once again, if we actually read the legislation to understand the intent of it, Sir, Section 21 is amended by saying that, to now say, all self-employed persons shall, from such day as the board may prescribe by order, be insured pursuant to Section 14 for personal injury arising out of and in the course of employment. The mandatory. In relation to the third schedule, the consequential amendments, sir, it says that the regulation 4 was deleted and this was substituted in its place. The amount of contribution payable by self-employed persons. Every self-employed person shall pay at least $1,200 as contribution per contribution year. Not may, not might, not should, but shall. And we know, sir, in law, shall is the mandatory. I read it again. Every self-employed person shall pay at least $1,200 as contributions per contribution year. So, sir, once again, it is mandatory. They've clarified it, they've highlighted the point, they've underlined an asterisk to show that it is a mandatory provision. But once again, sir, there are no penalties for enforcement. So, for those who wish to opt out, you're breaking the law, but this is one of those anomalous situations. I think probably one of the only ones in the law where there is no penalty for it. But what does it then do for you? Why does it make sense? We recently had the example of COVID, and we saw the benefit of the NIS, where self-employed persons benefited from contributions made by other persons. So they benefited from a fund to which they had never contributed. Conscience alone should dictate that we now take stock of where we are and the fact that we drew on something that we did not contribute to, and allow us, anybody who benefited, should be dictated by their conscience to now contribute to the NIS program. Sir, what were some of the challenges before? A lot of people said it was too difficult to do it. If you didn't start at the beginning, then you couldn't come in at the end. So I can speak from personal experience. Somewhere in there, about my 10th year as a lawyer, I was persuaded by no less a person than the Honourable Chief Justice, Sir Patterson Cheltenham, that the lawyers should actually start to contribute to NIS. And I contacted NIS, I called NIS, and I said, I want to start paying. It might have been more than 10 years, maybe like 15 years. I want to start paying. I see some people smile. I hope it was none of y'all that actually spoke to me on the phone, because of what I can say next. So I called and said, look, I'm a lawyer, I'm self-employed, I want to start paying. The person asked me, how long had I been practicing working as a lawyer? And I gave a time frame. I think it was 15 years. The person said, hold on, sir. And they went, assumedly, and they did their calculation, and they came back to me and said that I can start paying, but I would have to start by clearing up back contributions, which, if they just use it as a round figure, would amount to $18,000 or $19,000. I said, what? I said, well, I actually just want to start paying from now. They said, no, sir. If you come onto the scheme, you are due to pay the contributions that would have been due had you paid from the time you started to work. Well, you know what happened there? I didn't do it. I'll be frank. I'm saying quite up front, I didn't do it. And I'm not proud of it, right? And I don't stand as the minority. I stand with the majority, with 85% of self-employed people. I am glad to see now that there's provision that you can back pay for 3 years and come on to the scheme. I'm glad to see now that the National Insurance is actually working with people to try to get them on. Because I could not believe, sir, that where we were pushing, or where the government was pushing at the time, and the NIS was pushing at the time to get people onto the program, that there was zero flexibility. There was no flexibility or accommodation. It was either do this or no. I am glad to see that that is no longer the case. So for all of those who use the excuse that I couldn't come on because I couldn't afford the back pay, that is now a moot point. I am urging people, join the scheme. You can join from today and move forward as I understand it. Or if you want to get ahead of the curve a little bit, you can back pay for the 3 years. And it makes sense that every payment, that the total amount that you pay does not straight go to your credit fund. Because, sir, with things like funds, the things way above my contemplation. So I'm not an actuary. Sometimes what those people who are versed and learn in figures do and their computations bewilder me, sir. But as I understand, my basic understanding is that the ability to pay is dependent on the ability to invest. It depends on the pool, the seed money. It depends on the rate of return. You don't always invest in one thing. So it's not like the NAS invests in projects that will give it a guaranteed return of 4% or 5% or 10%. They have a portfolio of investments, and all these things are lumped together, and they use the formula to come up with exactly what the end of the year returns should be and whatnot. So I accept that by virtue of not having put any money 3 years ago, I can't get the credit for all the money. I am glad, again, to see that it is not a penalty situation. My learning friend from St. Peter, my colleague from St. Peter, he wanted to use the word penalty, sir, because he wanted to use the words that people understand. I would prefer to use, sir, a word like tolerable discount. So we're saying we will take your back pay, but you can't get full credit, right? Because the money would have devalued, it lost opportunity, not being able to use your money in the pool, whatnot. The other thing, sir, that Barbadians need to understand is the sustainability of the NAS program depends on the pool. The wider the base of contributions, the more money you have in your pool to be able to invest, is the more money you can look to get in returns. It is the more money to offset the payments that you have to make, and the longer that the fund survives. That's my basic knowledge. I keep looking over there to make sure I'm going right. I'm seeing a nod from the highly heralded PS of good report. And so it stands to the benefit of Barbados and Barbadians for more people to contribute. If even more people come onto the scheme, contributing at the bottom and working their way up to something manageable, it benefits the fund because there is a larger pool of money available to invest. The other thing, sir, that I looked at and I was glad to see, I'm not sure if it was in the original legislation, there's an investment committee. And the guidelines for the investments, the board appears now to have a little bit more flexibility in the range of things it can consider for investment. And it can also make recommendations to the minister, I guess if it wants a relaxation of policy to allow it to invest in certain things. When 20 years ago, sir, you were getting 4% interest from the bank. If you had a fixed term, I think you were getting 5% interest. But interest was outstripping inflation at that point in time. So if you had money on the bank, at the end of the year, it wasn't less, right? You were a little bit ahead of the curve. And the average Barbadian thought that his safest investment was to go and put all the money in Barclays. Under the bed, ain't earning nothing, and somebody might carry it away. In Barclays, you get a certain investment. Then the mutual funds came in. And people didn't necessarily understand what the mutual funds were, sir, but they understood you were getting a higher rate of return. And Bajans started to get investment savvy, or stock exchange came in, it was publicized. Barbadians started to look for investments. People asked, what can I invest in? But our investment and our concept of investment was limited. For something like the NAS, sir, I had the benefit and privilege. For 10 years, I sat on the board of directors of the Caribbean Court of Justice Trust Fund. I went in as a lawyer with no experience in in funds, but while there we learned that you can't just invest in one thing. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. The board and the investment committee of the NAS has to look at different funds, different avenues, emerging markets, all different kinds of stocks. They may look at how much cash you have in hand to do what it is that you need to do, whether or not you want to invest in property. And I see that there's a provision now for investment in property as well. Sir, and they have to manage the NAS fund because the NAS is intended to fund the retirement and the benefits of Barbadians in perpetuity. That means that based on the pool that you have and the amount of the contributions, you expect that this fund, or the projection is that this fund is supposed to last forever. If we have enough people coming in at the base and enough people contributing in accordance with the benefit they intend to derive, then technically speaking, the fund should last forever. We know it's not. There's certain variables that make it not so, but that's the overriding concept. So it requires, sir, an ability to be flexible, a need to be flexible, that the NAS fund and the investment committee can make decisions appropriate to the time and appropriate to the investments which are emerging. So I'm glad to see, sir, that there is some provision there and some flexibility for investment. So I also want to highlight the role that the NAS actually plays in Barbados. Sorry, before I get there, the other issue for self-employed persons, sir, is that while you were able to invest and draw a pension, the provision was not there if you got injured, or the provision was not there to cover you for disruption or anything like that. So your only benefit as opposed to an employee was to get a pension way down the line, and that was not attractive to a lot of people. So I see that has also been corrected so that self-employed persons who get injured in the course of their work, where if you had an employee, the employee would be compensated, you are also able, once you prove it, and the guidelines for proving it are there, you are also able, once you prove it, to be able to get the exact same benefit. So the self-employed person is literally put in they're recognized as being an employee of themselves for the purpose of obtaining all of the benefits that previously accrued to persons who were employees of others. So that is a major step. Had I not signed on already, that alone, sir, would make me sign on. So, what is the NAS? It's not just a fund. The NAS is involved at every step of Barbados' development. The reach of the NAS is visible to all Bajans. We said it, and it bears saying again and again and again. The reach of the NAS was felt during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if it didn't register on your radar before, it must have registered on your radar since then. So if you take a drive down the Pine Boulevard side, you will see a lovely building coming up. That is the headquarters for the Barbados Fire Service, and it will also as well house some of the ambulance service in it. That is not a fire service or a Ministry of Home Affairs project. That is an NAS project. It is financed by the NAS. They're overseeing the project. At the end of it, we're going to have a spanking, brand new, cutting-edge facility for housing, training, increasing the response times in Barbados, and that is from the NAS. It is an investment that the government is paying back for. So it shows the real connection of the NAS to the lives of the average Barbadian, based on the expansion of their, ability to manage their portfolio and to make recommendations. I expect to see a lot more projects from the NAS in Barbados, but I also believe that the contemplation is, if it has not yet happened, that the NAS should be able to invest overseas, right? Wherever the investment makes sense and can be justified, it makes sense for the NAS to be able to invest in it. If the NAS concentrated all their investments in Barbados and only locally, if the economy of Barbados crashes, the NAS crashes. There's no bailout. It goes down with the ship, which is not prudent. It makes sense to spread the investments as wide as possible so that you're protected against shocks and dangers, and that the fund does what it's supposed to do, sir, and is there when I might be closer than some people. I might be further than some, but I might be closer than some people, sir, and I expect that with prudent management, the NS will be able to take care of me when I'm no longer able to earn a dollar. Now, sir, I will now say this to the self-employed persons. I often, sir, when other persons present, I get up afterwards, if the AG is not here, to explain some of the legal aspects of the legislation, what it meant. As I heard the Honourable Member for St. Peter presenting the legislation, sir, I thought to myself, I should just get up simply and say, for once, I concur. And sit back down. It was so ably done. I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for St. Peter, who is the substantive line minister for the NAS. I want to congratulate him, A, on his presentation, B, on his stewardship of this whole exercise, and C, on the results that we have in front of us today. Nobody else is thumping? I will thump. I want to join him, sir, in congratulating the chairman, the deputy chairman, the board, the PS. This was not easy. It was not easy. We went through this exercise before, and the decision was taken that, you know what, we have to firm this up in relation to self-employed people, especially with what happened. We had to give the self-employed people every possible chance to join the NS fund. They now knowing the importance and reach of the fund. We had to make it easy for them, remove all of the valid excuses that were there before as to why the self-employed persons should not join. Down to, it was a stroke of genius, sir. It's a stroke of genius that it's not even a regular contribution. You put in a certain amount a year. Put it in. Because a lot of the self-employed people, work is seasonal. Those who hold parties and do crop-over events, you get your money at crop-over. Those who are involved in the tourism sector, you get your money 6 months a year. So if you are penalized, or if you're in trouble when you contribute January to June, but then you can't contribute June to December, then that may make you not go on in the first place. If it is now, I just mentioned the word AG. If it is now, sir, a situation where you can pay as you are able, and then the calculation is done for you at the end as is provided for in the legislation, and a schedule is sent to you showing you how your money and your contributions have been allocated, right? And if you have paid over the maximum amount, it is then, the rollover is sent on for the next year, right? And you're given the schedule so you understand. It even takes having to think about the contributions off of you. When you got the money, you put in what you can, knowing that you're investing in your future. So that was a novel input, sir. I don't know how the actuaries and those responsible for the calculations and allocations are going to work it out, but I assume they must know. But the fact is, it is not something I, as a self-employed person, now have to think about. I just have to think, I have made a certain amount of money. I can put some of this to savings, some of this to my bills, some of this to the NAS, and they can work it out and let me know at the end of the year. So I want to commend and congratulate them on that as well. So my final words, sir, to all the self-employed persons in Barbados. We have skated on thin ice for too long. We went through COVID, and we know that this government, because of a policy decision, bailed out a lot of the self-employed people as well, where they did not have to. We now know the benefit of the NIS. We now know and are certain that those benefits have been extended, not just from a pension when you retire, but also to cover work-related injuries. You are covered in that circumstance. We now know you can literally pay as you earn. Pay what you can, when you can. And it will be worked out for you. We now know there's no penalty now. If you want to join now, having never paid before, you are free to join now. All of these have been put in place to make it as easy as possible for you to do what the law says that you're supposed to do and pay your contribution, your minimum contribution. If you're working, if you are self-employed, your minimum contribution should be $100 a month. $1,200 in a year, that's $100 a month, sir. My math is not the best, divided by 30, that is, I don't know, like, how much? $3 a day. A little bit of money that secures your future and protects you if you are injured. The slogan, we all know it. The slogan has not changed from the time I was a child. It's more than a contribution. It's your lifeline. This is proved in COVID. All the things we used to quarrel about have been corrected. It is now time for the self-employed people in Barbados to also do their duty by Barbados. The fund bailed them out when they needed it. It is now time to contribute for the fund so the fund can bail out somebody else down the line. More than a contribution, sir. It's your lifeline. I entirely support the amendments.
Honourable for St. George, to Michael North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to lend my voice in support of the bill that is before the House today. And, Mr. Speaker, if I could start by commending the Honourable Member for St. Peter, Minister of Labour, who has not only successfully led several landmark pieces of legislation thus far, but also leading today's debate in another landmark piece of legislation and amendments thereto that will support, in particular, our self-employed citizens in Barbados. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member would have led amendments to the Safety and Health at Work legislation, excuse me, which enhanced provisions to create a safer work environment for our people. We had amendments, of course, Mr. Speaker, by this administration to our minimum wage, which would have guaranteed certain members of the working class a decent wage for decent work. We would have had under this same member for St. Peter an increased and enhanced recognition of the third sector, engaging these stakeholders, Mr. Speaker, and increasing their participation in building our society, building Barbados, building brand Barbados to what we have always known it to be and even beyond our aspirations. And of course, just a few months ago now in July, and then in August, we would have had this particular piece of legislation that relates to amendments to our National Insurance Fund, our National Insurance and Social Security Scheme. Mr. Speaker, there was a point in time in this Parliament when there was an opposition voice, an official opposition voice, and subsequent to that, we have had many opposition voices in our publics that continue to ask about growth, Mr. Speaker. Many of those voices would ask the question, where is the growth in the Barbados economy going to come from. They questioned all of the policies, they questioned the restructuring, they questioned how we were handling at that point in time our economic affairs, and they figured that we were doing these things recklessly, irresponsibly, and many times they accused us of such. And they would always table this question of where is the growth coming from? And Mr. Speaker, even as we talk about growth, I am pleased to present, and maybe even if it is not already a document of the House, the review of Barbados' economic performance, I believe it is, for January to September 2023 as presented by the Central Bank of Barbados. And one of the first things that it says in there, one of its opening statements, Mr. Speaker, it says, Barbados' economy expanded by 4.4% in the first 9 months of 2023. The largest 9-month expansion since 2006. Let me say that again. Barbados' economy expanded by 4.4% in the first 9 months of 2023, Mr. Speaker, the largest 9-month expansion since 2006. Like my honorable friend for St. Christchurch East, I think that deserves a better tongue. I don't want to have to ask, but since I have to. Yeah, but that is a tremendous statistic and reality. And what does it go on to say, Mr. Speaker? It says, this performance also accounts for the 10th consecutive quarter of economic growth. The 10th consecutive quarter of economic growth. They were asking, where is the growth? When is the growth going to come, Mr. Speaker? We've had 10 consecutive quarters of growth in this Barbados, Mr. Speaker, sir. Yes, sir. And that speaks for itself. That's right. And this broad-based, it goes on, Mr. Speaker, it says, this broad-based growth boosted tax collections. It improved labor market conditions. It reduced the debt to GDP ratio, Mr. Speaker. It narrowed our trade deficit. It increased our foreign reserve levels as well, Mr. Speaker. And it improved our credit quality as well as bank profitability. They asked, where is the growth? That is where the growth is, Mr. Speaker. We are seeing the growth in our country. But it is sad, Mr. Speaker, that even as their credibility has now been shot relative to the question of our growth, they have now turned to a position of questioning our debt. And oftentimes, and I am not going to venture too far into this area because we have learned friends in the member for Christchurch East Central, and of course our Prime Minister and leader from St. Michael Northeast, who would be able to handle these economic questions far more succinctly and effectively than I can. But of course, just to say, Mr. Speaker, that whilst the question of growth has been answered and they now turn their attention to our debt and they accuse us, Mr. Speaker, of excessively borrowing. And that too has fallen on its face because, Mr. Speaker, we knew that when we came into this administration, we found a debt position of about $18 billion. We were able to reduce that, Mr. Speaker, to about $12 billion due to our economic recovery plan. The Barbados Economic Recovery Plan, Part 1 and now Part 2. Of course, due to COVID, it went back up a little bit, and I think right now, if I stand to be corrected by the honourable member for Christchurch East Central, I believe it hovers right now at about $14 billion or so. And our economy, therefore, Mr. Speaker, even though it has grown and even though we have taken back on some debt, there is no way that anyone can assess and evaluate that this administration has been recklessly borrowing, has been recklessly going about its affairs. We have actually quite the opposite, Mr. Speaker, have been doing so in a very responsible manner. Because whilst we've been taking on debt, Mr. Speaker, we've been able to show and account for what that debt has been used for. It has been used to purchase trucks, garbage trucks, Mr. Speaker. It has been used to purchase electric buses, Mr. Speaker. It has been used to fix our roads, Mr. Speaker. It has been used across many different fields, across many different sectors, across many different industries to allow for our country to breathe and to recover and to come to a place now of growth again. But Mr. Speaker, I've been having this conversation even as we talk to so many of our people. I speak to constituents, I speak to colleagues, I speak to the average citizen in Barbados. And many times I hear their remarks relative to the potholes, and I hear their remarks relative to the water coming out of the pipes, and sometimes it is brown, and sometimes it is red, and sometimes it is green, and sometimes it's all sorts of colors. Honourable Member for St. Andrew. It is unfortunate that we have such a situation, and we concede, Mr. Speaker, that everything is not perfect in our country. I don't think that anyone here in this government, anyone in this parliament, would even make the claim of such. I believe that we understand that we are working within our means. We have many different challenges that have beset us on many different sides, and we are doing the very best that we can with what we have, Mr. Speaker. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that I can speak on the behalf of every single member in this honorable house and say, whilst we recognize that we are not perfect, each of us get up every single day, Mr. Speaker, with one intention and desire, and that is to do right by the people of Barbados. That is to give our best to the people of Barbados. We come to work every single day, not only the members on the front bench, Mr. Speaker, the executive, but every member of this parliament, even members of the public service, who come to work every single day to put our country back on a path not only of growth, but of excellence, Mr. Speaker, sir. And it's not an easy task with all the various things that have come against us. But we are trying and we are doing what we can. But what have we come to as a nation when, with all of these efforts being made, we have a small number of people who continue, sir, to try to make a mockery of the things that we are doing? There are persons out there who are seeking on a daily basis to score cheap political points. And some of them who even desire and aspire to lead our country one day. And they continue to look at the work that's being done by this administration. And they do their utmost best to pull down, to set back, to undermine, even through their speech, through their very actions, the good work that's being done by this administration. Sir, we have our challenges, but have we not done any good for our country? Did we not save our dollar from devaluation, Mr. Speaker? Did we not reinstate free tertiary education, Mr. Speaker? Did we not increase our non-contributory pensions and grant 2 salary increases, Mr. Speaker? Did we not rebuild several roads in our country? Did we not support businesses, as you would have heard the Honourable Member for St. Peter say, even during COVID with the business interruption levy, the business interruption benefit, Mr. Speaker? And did we not pass landmark legislation that gave a national minimum wage, whistleblower protection, integrity in public life, decriminalizing vending, and of course, Mr. Speaker, one of the greatest leading our country into becoming a republic? So the administration that has done so much, and even with this bill that is before us today, seeking once again to do even more for a section of our populace that is right now underrepresented. Seeking to expand the benefits, seeking to expand the protections for a group of our society, our citizenry, that has made a large contribution to our country. Our administration, sir, is doing a good job, and I think it ought to be commended for so doing. So they asked the question relative to growth, and let's look at it. Mr. Speaker, we've had many growth initiatives. The growth has already started, as I showed you. Our projects and our programs, led ably by our Honourable Senior Minister and the member for Christchurch West, leading many initiatives, I think over 100 projects in the pipeline that are due to bring tremendous growth to this country, not only from the perspective of the economic return that is going to come, the investment that has come through those projects, but of course the employment opportunities that it will generate. And as we know, Mr. Speaker, when more people are employed, more money circulates in our economy, and all of this takes over and it causes all of us to rise. So there's tremendous growth that is in the pipeline, already occurring and in the pipeline. And these particular amendments to the National Insurance and Social Security support our economic growth as well, Mr. Speaker. We are setting out to provide a better deal for our self-employed citizens. And how are we going to do that? I have many self-employed people in St. Michael North, Mr. Speaker. As I have gone throughout the constituency, I've actually discovered quite a few people I didn't even know were self-employed. As you go to homes, you don't know what you will find. And as you interact with persons, you realize that some of them are making cosmetic products. There are many of them who are engaged in different types of services, whether it be massage therapy. There's some out there who are making all sorts of handicrafts. There's some out there, Mr. Speaker, who are engaged in metalwork, woodwork. There's so many different persons engaged in self-employment across the length and breadth of St. Michael North that I know that these new provisions will benefit them. What are they? Full flexibility as to when and how much you will contribute. Mr. Speaker, they don't have to fill out forms anymore. They don't have to go through this monthly minimum and monthly maximums regime. They now have a high degree of flexibility in how they're going to make their contributions on a yearly basis. They could even do it once a year, Mr. Speaker. This is a tremendous benefit for a self-employed person. Having been one myself, I know that it is very difficult to find time when you're running your own business. Sometimes it's difficult to be able to pull yourself away from the operations to take care of some of the administrative burdens that are necessary for your business to be able to function in the way it ought to function. So giving a self-employed person in additional flexibility in how they're going to make their contributions, that is already a master stroke by this administration, Mr. Speaker, sir. They can also make their payments online. That, again, is a tremendous benefit. Not having to go down to any physical building, not having to go anywhere, Mr. Speaker, sir, and to pay in their contributions, but being able to do so in the comfort of their own business place, in the comfort of their own home, which in many cases are one in the same. They can make their contributions online, Mr. Speaker, and this is tremendously important for them. What else? We are offering them the opportunity to have their coverage extending to employment injury benefits as well. And this was hitherto not seen. So you have self-employed persons, Mr. Speaker, who would be engaged in woodwork, working with all sorts of heavy equipment, engaged in road work even, heavy equipment. And they could run the risk on a daily basis of becoming injured, Mr. Speaker, sir. And there was no injury benefit for them, like there is for the average person who's employed by a company. But now we have given them the assurance that under this new regime, these benefits now extend to them, that the contributions that they're making, Mr. Speaker, will cover them in the event of an injury as well. And also, Mr. Speaker, we know that there is a reality that we have to face. There are many people who work for Company A, but they also do something on the side. They also have their own endeavor, their own self-employed business, their own self-employment endeavors that they engage in. And many times, Mr. Speaker, people will feel hard done because when they went to NIS and they were making their contributions of whatever level, usually not up to the maximum level of contributions or earnings, but at whatever level. And if they wanted to make their contributions as a self-employed person, there was no regime, there was no mechanism that allowed for them to be able to do so as an employed person. We have now changed that with this legislation, Mr. Speaker, and we're allowing persons who are employed by companies to also have the opportunity to make additional contributions as a self-employed person. And that itself is a master stroke as well. Using the technology again, we are also going to be sending them reminders about their contribution, their need to make their contributions by SMS and email. Once again, because these are busy individuals and those reminders will help. And they can also check their contributions online. Mr. Speaker, these and many other things are exposed in this legislation. And all together, they work together to provide a suite of benefits that would allow our self-employed people in this Barbados to have a better deal and to make a greater contribution to our country and our GDP, our country's growth and our advancement as a nation. I think that needs to be applauded. That should be commended by this Barbados Labour Party administration. But that's not all, Mr. Speaker. As I talk about growth, this whole presentation by me today is going to be on growth. In my own portfolio, Mr. Speaker, I have the honor and privilege of leading two things: the industrial transformation of our country and the digital transformation of our country. And many times persons, when we interact with the digital transformation side of things, we think of the change and how it's going to make us uncomfortable and how we have to do things differently. And of course, with every bit of change, there's a level of discomfort. And my job and the ministry that I lead and our team has the responsibility of holding the hands of Barbadians through these changes and to help us to come through those changes successfully, navigate those changes successfully. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that we're on that trajectory. And you may ask, how does digitizing and digitalizing, how does moving a paper-based record to make it a digital record, and how does taking a fully analog service, an in-person service, and turn it into a fully online and remote service? You may ask the question, how does that help with growth? Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, every dollar that is saved in a business can then be used as an investment in that business for growth. And that is how the difference is made. So when technology is employed, when digitization is employed, when digitalization is employed by a government and by its private sector in tow, that will lead to savings, it will lead to enhanced efficiency, it will lead to improved effectiveness in the business affairs, and all of that will redound to the potential for greater business investment, which then leads to what? Growth, Mr. Speaker. So that's how the digital transformation is going to feed in to the growth that we're trying to deliver for our people here in Barbados. But not just that. The second part of the portfolio, the second main remit of this portfolio that I have the honor of leading, is the industrial transformation, sir. And industry really is the first word in the portfolio's name. And it can be summed up as relating to the group of productive enterprises or organizations that provide or supply goods, services, or sources of income. And we usually think of manufacturers when we think of industry. So those persons out there who are making chairs, are making pottery, that are making handicraft, that are making beaded chains and different things for our tourists and others. We usually think of manufacturing when we think of industry. When we think of persons who are making condiments and sauces, these are the things that first come to mind. Those are all industries that are productive, that are producing, that are earning our country income, that are contributing to our GDP as a nation and allowing us to be able to perform and to do and to excel as an economy. And that's why this bill is so important, because many of those industries that I just listed for you, Mr. Speaker, many of them are led by entrepreneurs, small, micro-sized enterprises led by self-employed individuals. And these initiatives today and amendments will give them the platform that they need to be able to excel, to grow, and to make a bigger contribution to our overall nation's GDP, gross domestic product. We know of the leading industries that make a large contribution. We know about rum. Rum is one of our leading industries. It has been for many years. It continues to be. So we produce rum and we export rum. We make a lot of money off of the sale and production of rum. We also have fats and oils. A lot of people don't know that, but fats and oils, another big industry of ours. Insecticides. Some of the largest exports of this country relate to insecticides. We have firms in this country that are doing extremely well in that regard. Construction materials, of course, and aggregates are going off our shores on a daily basis and providing a tremendous boost to our GDP. But there are also smaller industries, Mr. Speaker, that have been making tremendous contributions and that have the potential to make even bigger contributions to our economy. And many of these relate to what? I will name just a few of them. Fashion, film, and furniture. Fashion industry, film industry, and our furniture industry. Mr. Speaker, sir, as it stands right now, the fashion industry has a global value of US $768.7 billion. The global fashion industry has a value today of US $768.7 billion. Whilst the film industry stands at approximately US $97.47 billion. Film stands at a value, global value, of approximately US $97.47 billion. And as it relates to the furniture industry, the global market for this right now, Mr. Speaker, stands at approximately US $557 billion. $557 billion. These are massive, those three alone are massive industries, and they suggest to us that there's tremendous potential for local fashion designers, local filmmakers, local furniture makers and producers to be able to tap into those massive global industries to earn not only a living for themselves, but to boost the overall economy of our country. There's tremendous potential there. There's tremendous untapped potential. So when we come today and we do what for some may seem to be a simple amendment to allow for self-employed persons to have a better deal, we are actually providing a platform for growth for our people and for our country, Mr. Speaker, sir. So we cannot take it lightly what we're doing here today. So how are we supporting growth in these particular industries and others? Export Barbados is the state-owned enterprise that falls under my ministry and under my remit and my responsibility. And they've been doing a fantastic job in supporting micro, small, and medium-sized businesses for many, many years. I sat as a board director of this entity for a long time, many years ago, and I saw the tremendous work that was done as the institute sought to, and the organization sought to invest in our micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. They had at that point in time a facility, a loan facility that was given to businesses to be able to grow and expand their product offerings, usually with the perspective, Mr. Speaker, of boosting exports. And we're in the process, Mr. Speaker, at the BIDC of doing what we did last year, November, which was the creation of a shared use facility called the International Food Science Center. And for these three industries, we are taking a similar approach, Mr. Speaker. Shared use facilities allow for people to come together in one space to make use, either through micro-leasing or renting, to make use of the latest technologies, to make use of the space. Mr. Speaker, you can tell me that there's a furniture maker and there is, a furniture maker too actually, furniture maker in St. Michael North, has to build on a little appendage to his home, to his property, so that he can cover and he can do his work, that will cover him and so he can do his work. And he has to invest, Mr. Speaker, sometimes thousands of dollars and in some cases tens of thousands of dollars to buy the equipment that is needed for him to be able to produce a quality product. There are other micro contributors and micro players in that same industry that do not have the wherewithal when they first start business to be able to make that kind of investment, Mr. Speaker. If you have to buy a plane or if you have to buy whatever it may be that costs, let's say, $25,000, you don't have it in your pocket, Mr. Speaker, how are you going to be able to invest in your business? How would you be able to get clients? How would you be able to make a living? So what we are doing with our shared use facility approach to supporting the film industry, the fashion industry, and the furniture industry is that we're going to create these spaces where the practitioners of those industries will be able to have access to the space, access to the latest technologies, access to the latest equipment. Thereby, they don't have to look for the capital, Mr. Speaker, to invest on their own. They can use what the government has provided for them, and they can churn out their product, high-quality product that will make a difference in their lives and, of course, the lives of all of us as Barbadians. Not only to meet local consumption needs, but all of this, Mr. Speaker, the orientation of the Export Barbados BIDC, the orientation of my ministry, Mr. Speaker, is exports. We are oriented towards exports. So we want our self-employed people who we're catering to today with this bill. We want them to be able to be supported, uplifted. We want their businesses to grow. We want them to make a stronger and more robust contribution to the NAS scheme or fund, of course. But we also want them to be able to reach the point where they can not only satisfy local and domestic needs, but they can also export their products, earning us foreign exchange, growing our GDP, and all of us, as the saying goes, a rising tide raises all boats. We go further. Our Prime Minister, in one of her budgetary presentations, announced that $2 million was going to be allocated and earmarked and given to Export Barbados specifically for the fashion industry. In conjunction with the National Cultural Foundation, the work has already commenced, Mr. Speaker, to build up the space and to procure the equipment that will be useful and needed for us to be able to support the fashion industry here in Barbados. We have many self-employed fashion designers. We have many people who are a part of the fashion industry at many different points and many different areas relative to that particular industry. All of them are stakeholders in this regard. And in many cases, as I said, Mr. Speaker, they're not able to access their own equipment. So providing with that $2 million that the Prime Minister has earmarked, that she has so generously given to us, that allows us to be able to build out a space specifically for fashion that would allow them to be able to access that equipment, access those technologies, and thereby improve their products and their services. We're not stopping there. We're supporting film as well. At the BIDC's estates, the Export Barbados estates, we are creating a studio. We are creating a green room that will provide for filmmakers. Mr. Speaker, there's so many people. I mean, a lot of us watch Netflix, for example. And you go on Netflix and you see films coming from all over the world. We have people in India producing films. We have people in Hollywood, of course, producing films. We have people in every part of the world. South America producing films, Europe producing films. And they're producing films, Mr. Speaker, now at very low costs, very low budgets, because they're utilizing equipment that is cutting edge, and because technology, as it does, has now become a lot more reasonable in its pricing in some of these cases. They're able now to use the technology and to produce films. And they have many different film grants and many different associations that allow these films, once produced, to be able to get access to platforms like Netflix, for example. So when we create this studio space, we want our self-employed filmmakers. We want the micro filmmaker, the person who is a YouTube blogger, a vlogger. We want the persons who are out there looking to be creatives using a camera or a phone. We want them to have a space and access to a space and access to technology that would allow them to be able to produce a product that they can then go and sell to some company, whether it be overseas or even locally. We have films in Barbados that have already reached global acclaim, international acclaim, produced right here in this Barbados. We've had companies that came to Barbados to take some of their footage, Mr. Speaker. And we have local Barbadians that we need to give the same rights and opportunities to develop a film industry, a robust film industry in our country. Relative to the furniture, and I'm beginning to wind down and close, Mr. Speaker. Relative to our furniture industry, we're doing similarly. We're providing a space where these individuals will be able to come and utilize the latest equipment. And as I speak about furniture, Mr. Speaker, my mind shifts right here in this moment. And I know that we've had many people over the years that were making the traditional furniture, and that is fine. Mr. Speaker, I grew up in a house where we had wrought iron chairs first, and the wrought iron chairs were spray painted black. And I remember every Christmas I had to do the job when I got to a certain age of having to spray paint the chairs over, and the black spray paint. And then we had the gold spray paint, and we would put little dots of gold spray paint, to put a little design on the wrought iron furniture. That was my task at Christmas when I was a child. We graduated, if you were, to mahogany furniture eventually. Nice three-piece set. Wonderful, beautiful. I wish I still had it now, to be honest. Reminds me of the chairs that we sit in here in the Honourable House. But we had a wonderful mahogany set at that point in time, manufactured locally, of course. And since then, we've seen the furniture industry, unfortunately, take a dip, and we're not seeing as many of those types of pieces being produced anymore. But even as we would want to reinvigorate that side of furniture manufacturing, I want to encourage our furniture manufacturers out there to think even more broadly, to think even more innovatively, because the world has changed. The way that people use space has changed. And you now have a lot of persons who are working from at home. Same self-employed people that we're talking about today and providing benefits for. Many of them are working from at home. And I've seen so many videos, Mr. Speaker, of persons who have, on one side of their room, they have their bed. But then during the course of the day, they can flip that bed up, and out underneath the bed comes a table. And at that table is where they sit down and they do their work on a daily basis. Can you imagine how innovative it would be for our furniture producers here in Barbados to create those fit-for-purpose pieces of furniture that now relate to and tie in to the realities of work and life in Barbados today? Many people are using, they don't have a separate space for dining and a separate space for living anymore. Sometimes these spaces are one and the same. We need to have furniture that fits these spaces, that can be versatile, that you can switch and reorient, and that you can use for multiple purposes. We need our furniture designers, our furniture producers to start thinking along these lines. So even as we provide space for them to be able to have access to the latest equipment, the latest technologies, we want them to come in there with computer-aided designs, assistants, and design new and novel pieces of furniture. Mr. Speaker, why can't there be a Caribbean IKEA? Why can't there be a Caribbean IKEA? But we know of IKEA as the international giant that produces packaged equipment in furniture. You can get almost anything in a box from IKEA. And they give you an instruction manual and hopefully all the pieces.
The honourable member has 2 more minutes.
I'm winding down. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They give you a box and hopefully all the pieces. And then you have the task, if you're good at it, of putting it all together. And when you're done, you have a wonderful chest of drawers or whatever it may be that you were seeking to set up. So, Mr. Speaker, as I close, I support wholeheartedly the Honourable Member for St. Peter. I support wholeheartedly this amendment. I believe, Mr. Speaker, it is timely. I believe that our self-employed persons who make a tremendous contribution, in fact, micro, small, and medium-sized businesses in Barbados make the biggest contribution to our economy when we actually stop and look at it and analyze and extract out. Many of our people are working in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We don't really see the contribution because we don't feel it. Because we see just small business coconut vendor or small business hairdresser or small business nail tech. But altogether, the vast majority of our people are engaged in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And therefore, we need to support them better. And I believe that these amendments today under this NIS amendment, I believe that this provides a platform for our self-employed people to survive and thrive. As I close, I encourage every self-employed person to take these benefits by the horn. Grab them, run with them, make the most of them. Because we're not only expecting that we will give you the benefit of a better platform for your benefits, for you to receive benefits, but we're also expecting that there will be a responsibility on your part to be able to make even better contributions to our NIS scheme going forward. The contributions made by the self-employed persons will not necessarily just take care of their own requirements later on in life, but they help us to be able to provide for our pensioners today, tomorrow, and in the years to come. I encourage every one of them, and as we continue to build out as a country, as a government, as we continue to invest in these various portfolios, whether it be at Export Barbados, whether it be at MISS, whether it be at agriculture, whether it be at sports and youth, wherever it is, Mr. Speaker, we are investing in the growth of our economy so that our people will benefit, because it is our desire to make Barbados the best place to live, to work, and to recreate, and to give a better life for our people. I'm obliged to you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the suspension of the House until 2:35 p.m.
Question is that this Honourable Chairman be suspended until 2:30 p.m. All those honourable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. This honourable chamber stands suspended until 2:35 p.m.